What if the men who led the Confederacy never truly believed the war would last beyond a single season? And what if those very generals, so confident, so certain of swift victory, were caught in a nightmare that stretched into 4 long, bloody years? The American Civil War was not born out of calm calculation. It erupted with fiery speeches, with drums of pride, and with a belief that destiny was on their side. Confederate leaders told their soldiers the war would be short, almost easy. One victory, they said, and the North will break. They imagined parades through Washington, quick treaties, and a return to a way of life they refused to surrender. But instead of a brief clash, they were dragged into one of the longest, deadliest struggles in American history. Why were they so confident? What blinded them to the storm that was coming? And how did their miscalculation change the fate of millions? Stay with me as we step into the minds of those generals, walk the dusty camps where soldiers whispered rumors of quick victories, and uncover how misplaced confidence became a nation's greatest disaster. This is the story they never expected, and one you will never forget. What if the greatest war in American history began with men who believed it would be over before the leaves fell? And what if the very leaders who promised swift glory were unknowingly marching their soldiers into a nightmare of endless blood and suffering? The year was 1861. The air was thick with tension, but also with misplaced certainty. In the South, crowds gathered in courthouse squares and city streets, their cheers echoing like a festival more than a farewell to war. Mothers waved handkerchiefs, wives pinned flowers to uniforms, and fathers told their sons they would be back home by Christmas. The atmosphere was not of doom, but of celebration, as though this war was a brief excursion, a duel that would prove Southern strength once and for all. The Confederate generals fed this belief. They assured the people that the North lacked the stomach for a long fight, that the Union was divided, and that victory would be swift, decisive, and glorious. But behind the bravado, a dangerous illusion was forming. These generals, men like Robert E. Lee, Joseph Johnston, and P.G.T. Beauregard, were steeped in a tradition of honor and pride. They looked to history, remembering how wars in Europe were often decided in a single campaign, a single season. They convinced themselves that 1 or 2 victories on Southern soil would force the North to the negotiating table. Their voices rang with confidence, but it was a confidence built on sand. In Richmond, the new Confederate capital, legislators toasted to independence as if it were already won. Newspapers printed bold predictions. 1 Southern gentleman is worth 10 Yankees. Recruitment posters promised a righteous cause and assured volunteers of a quick return. Men enlisted in droves, some carrying ancient muskets, others simply eager for glory. They saw war as an adventure, not yet a horror. Yet even in those early days, shadows hinted at the truth. Supplies were scarce. The South had little industry compared to the North. Ammunition was limited, and railroads, though vital, were fewer and fragile. Still, the illusion of a short war held sway. No one wanted to imagine a drawn-out conflict. To do so would be to admit weakness, to confess doubt, and pride would not allow it. The first great test came at Manassas, a small Virginia railway junction the world would soon know as Bull Run. In July 1861, Union forces marched confidently toward it, believing they too would end the rebellion quickly. Northern politicians and civilians even came along with picnic baskets, eager to watch the final battle. On both sides, naivety reigned. The clash that followed shattered illusions, but not in the way most expected. The Confederate generals had assured their men that the Yankees would break at the first sign of resistance. But as the sun rose over the fields near Bull Run, they discovered an enemy far more determined than they had believed. Cannons thundered, muskets roared, and the peaceful Virginia countryside was transformed into a hellscape. Soldiers who had marched out to cheers now stumbled through choking smoke and the cries of the wounded. It was here that General Thomas Jackson earned his immortal name, Stonewall. Amid the chaos, his brigade stood firm, refusing to retreat, rallying others with their grim determination. The Confederates ultimately forced the Union Army into a panicked retreat back toward Washington, their picnic spectators caught in the stampede. It was a Confederate victory, and Southern towns erupted in celebration. Bells rang, churches gave thanks, and Confederate newspapers proclaimed that independence was now certain. But hidden beneath the triumph was a dangerous truth. Instead of discouraging the North, the defeat enraged it. The Union realized this war would not be won with half measures. Recruitment surged, industry roared into action, and leaders in Washington vowed to crush the rebellion no matter how long it took. The Confederates, blind in their pride, misread the moment. They believed Bull Run proved their theory, that the North had no will for war. In reality, it hardened the Union resolve, setting the stage for years of unrelenting struggle. Why did the Confederate generals not see the storm building? Perhaps it was arrogance, perhaps desperation. They clung to the belief that time was on their side. Cotton was king, they said, and Europe would intervene. Britain and France, hungry for Southern cotton, would never allow the Confederacy to fail. This belief fueled their confidence, blinding them further to the reality of their isolation. Yet as months passed, no European power came to their aid. The South's gamble on foreign intervention was as fragile as the promises made to the young men who marched away from home. By the winter of 1861, the dream of a short war had already begun to crumble. Camps spread across Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, filled with men who had thought they would be home by Christmas. Now they huddled in the cold, their uniforms ragged, their shoes worn thin. Disease spread faster than bullets, claiming more lives than battles. Letters home grew darker, the laughter of summer replaced by the silence of graves. And yet, Confederate leaders still clung to hope. They reassured their people that the next campaign, the next victory, would break the Union's will. They could not admit the truth, not yet, that they had led their people into a war that would devour them. What makes this moment so haunting is not only the miscalculation, but the human cost of it. Young men, some barely more than boys, believed the words of their leaders. They marched into the smoke of battle, trusting that they would be back home in time for Christmas dinners, that their mothers' prayers would not stretch into years of sorrow. Instead, they were swallowed by a conflict that grew larger, darker, and bloodier with every passing season. The Confederate generals never expected it. They thought war would be quick, perhaps even noble. But war is never noble. It grinds dreams into dust. It exposes illusions for what they are. And by the end of that first year, the Confederacy was already locked in a war they could not escape. A war that would last 4 long, devastating years. And yet, the greatest irony remains. The very victories that gave them confidence, like Bull Run, were the seeds of their downfall. For every triumph hardened the Union's resolve, while every assumption drew the South deeper into a pit from which it could not climb. The war they thought would end by Christmas had only just begun, and the cost would be far beyond what anyone could have imagined. So why did these generals persist in their illusions? What drove them to keep believing in quick victories long after the evidence turned against them? The answer lies in the deeper story of pride, politics, and desperation that unfolded as the war dragged on. That story will take us deeper into the heart of the Confederacy, and into the minds of men who could not see the trap they had built for themselves. What if an entire nation staked its survival on a single crop, and believed it would bend the world to its will? And what if Confederate leaders, blinded by pride, mistook temporary triumphs for proof that destiny was on their side? The Confederacy was born out of conviction, not calculation. Its generals and politicians told their people that the South was stronger, braver, and more united than the industrial North. They spoke of chivalry, of honor, of the fighting spirit of the Southern gentleman. To them, the war was not just about independence. It was about proving superiority, and at the heart of this illusion stood one mighty belief, that King Cotton would rule the world. Cotton was the lifeblood of Southern wealth. Vast plantations stretched across states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, feeding Britain's textile mills and Europe's markets. Southern leaders believed no nation could survive without their cotton. If the Union blockaded them, they reasoned, Britain and France would intervene. They imagined European fleets breaking the northern stranglehold, their armies marching in support of the South. With such allies, the Confederacy thought victory was inevitable. But this vision was a mirage. Britain and France watched carefully, balancing their hunger for cotton against their fear of war with the Union. They were not eager to gamble on a rebellion that might collapse. Yet Confederate leaders clung to the belief that cotton alone would summon foreign powers to their rescue. It was a fatal miscalculation, and it shaped every decision they made. In the summer of 1861 and into 1862, Confederate victories seemed to justify their arrogance. At battles like Seven Pines and the 7 Days, Robert E. Lee and his generals outmaneuvered Union armies. Newspapers in Richmond and Charleston declared the South unbeatable. Ordinary Southerners believed their generals were invincible, ordained by God to protect their way of life. Men who had once doubted now rushed to enlist, eager to join what seemed to be a tide of endless triumphs. But beneath the glory, the cracks were widening. Each Confederate victory came at a terrible price. Supplies dwindled, ammunition ran low, and soldiers began to march barefoot, their stomachs empty. The North, meanwhile, had harnessed its industrial power. Railroads carried Union armies swiftly across vast distances, Factories in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio churned out rifles, cannons, and uniforms by the thousands. For every Confederate musket, the Union could field 5. For every ship the South launched, the North built a fleet. Yet the Confederate leaders continued to believe that spirit and honor would triumph over steel and numbers. The illusion of superiority was not just military, it was cultural. Southern leaders believed Northerners were soft, untrained in war, lacking the courage of their agrarian rivals. They mocked the idea that factory men could stand against sons of the soil. But reality proved otherwise. At Shiloh in 1862, the Union Army under Ulysses S. Grant absorbed a brutal Confederate assault, suffering staggering losses. Instead of retreating in defeat, they rallied and counterattacked, driving the Confederates from the field. It was a shocking revelation. The North would not break. It would bleed, but it would not surrender. Still, the Confederate generals reassured their people. They promised that the next battle would bring the North to its knees. They told weary soldiers that victory was close, that their sacrifices were not in vain. The myth of Southern supremacy had to be maintained, even as reality slipped further away. Pride demanded it, and pride became a prison. One of the greatest examples of this illusion was Lee's decision to carry the war into the North. In 1862, after victories in Virginia, he marched his army into Maryland, believing that a triumph on Union soil would force the North to the negotiating table. His soldiers sang with confidence as they crossed the Potomac, convinced that they were invincible. But at Antietam, reality struck again. The battle raged from dawn to dusk, the bloodiest single day in American history. Thousands lay dead, the fields soaked in crimson. Lee's army was forced to retreat, battered and exhausted. The Confederates claimed survival as a kind of victory. But the truth was undeniable. The North was not broken. The war would not end with a single blow. And yet, the illusion lived on. Southerners clung to the belief that one decisive victory still awaited, that the next campaign would tip the scales. They believed Europe would soon step in. They believed God himself was on their side. But belief could not forge bullets, nor feed starving soldiers. The Confederacy was fighting with passion, but passion alone cannot fill empty wagons. As 1862 turned into 1863, hope began to fade in whispers. Families who had sent their sons to war heard nothing but silence. Mothers scanned the lists of the dead. Fathers buried sons in shallow graves. The promise of a quick war was gone, yet leaders still told the people that victory was certain. It was a dangerous deception, one that demanded more blood with every passing month. Perhaps the most haunting part of this illusion was how deeply it blinded those who led. Even when defeat loomed, when cities burned, when soldiers deserted from hunger, the generals continued to speak of destiny. They could not admit failure, for to do so would unravel the very cause they fought for. Pride demanded belief, even as reality demanded surrender. The South's illusion of supremacy was a double-edged sword. It inspired courage, yes, but it also locked them into a war they could not win. They believed they were stronger, braver, chosen. But the war would prove otherwise. For every Confederate victory hardened the Union, while every Confederate defeat drained the South's strength. The war was becoming a contest not of pride, but of endurance. And endurance was something the North had in overwhelming supply. So the question lingers. When did the Confederate leaders truly realize the illusion had collapsed? Was it after Antietam, when their invasion failed? Was it after Gettysburg, when their gamble ended in disaster? Or was it only at the bitter end, when their cities lay in ruins and their soldiers marched barefoot into captivity? The answer is elusive, but the tragedy is clear. The illusion of Southern supremacy cost thousands of lives and chained the South to a destiny it could not escape. The war they thought would end quickly was now stretching into years, and the illusions that once gave them confidence were now dragging them into despair. The Confederacy's pride had sown its fate, and the harvest would be bitter. What happens when the pride of generals blinds them to the suffering of their own people? And what if the very confidence that once inspired a nation becomes the noose tightening around its neck? By the time the war stretched into its second and third year, the Confederacy was no longer riding on the wave of early victories. The dream of a short and glorious conflict had faded, replaced by a grinding struggle that consumed everything in its path. Yet still, Confederate leaders spoke with certainty. They promised their citizens that victory was inevitable, that one more bold strike would bring the North to its knees. But beneath these promises lay a reality too devastating to ignore: the staggering human cost of arrogance. The war that was supposed to be quick had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. Young men who had once marched off to cheers were now buried in shallow graves across Virginia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Entire towns had lost their sons, their husbands, their fathers. Fields lay untended. Families struggled to survive without the hands that once worked them, and hunger crept across the South like a shadow. Yet the generals insisted that the sacrifice was temporary, that the harvest of blood would soon yield independence. Nowhere was this cost felt more deeply than on the battlefield itself. At Shiloh in April 1862, Confederate leaders had believed they could smash Grant's army before it was reinforced. They attacked with fury, driving the Union soldiers back toward the Tennessee River. For a moment, it seemed as if the bold gamble might succeed. But the next day, Union reinforcements arrived, and the tide turned. The Confederates were forced to retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. The dream of quick victory turned into the nightmare of endless attrition, and yet arrogance persisted. Generals convinced themselves that bravery alone could make up for dwindling supplies and manpower. They launched assaults that cost thousands of lives, believing sheer willpower could overcome the Union's growing strength. At Fredericksburg in December 1862, Robert E. Lee's army held firm against wave after wave of Union attacks, inflicting massive casualties. It was hailed as a stunning Confederate victory. But for every Union soldier lost, the North had thousands more to replace him. For every Confederate who fell, the South bled deeper into weakness. What looked like triumph on the battlefield was in truth a slow strangulation. Beyond the battlefields, the home front was unraveling. Blockades choked off southern ports, cutting the Confederacy from foreign supplies. Families could no longer buy basic necessities. Salt, vital for preserving food, became scarce. Shoes were a luxury, and soldiers marched with rags wrapped around their feet. Mothers watched their children grow thin, their cries unanswered by a government too consumed with pride to admit the truth. Desertion rates rose, as starving soldiers abandoned the front lines to care for their families. Still, Confederate leaders painted illusions of progress. They told their people to endure, to sacrifice more, even as the dream slipped further away. Perhaps the most haunting moment of arrogance came with the invasion of the North in 1863. Lee believed that a victory on Union soil would break Northern morale once and for all. His army marched into Pennsylvania full of confidence, singing songs of glory. But at Gettysburg, they met the full might of the Union. For 3 days, the fields of Pennsylvania became a slaughterhouse. On the third day, Pickett's charge turned into a massacre, with Confederate soldiers mowed down in open fields under relentless Union fire. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Lee's army limped back to Virginia, broken but not destroyed. And yet the Confederacy still refused to face the truth. Gettysburg should have shattered the illusion of invincibility. Instead, it was spun as just another setback, another step on the long road to inevitable victory. Arrogance had blinded them. Each new defeat was explained away, each new loss hidden behind rhetoric of honor and destiny. But the human cost could no longer be concealed. Letters from soldiers painted a grim picture. Bodies left unburied, comrades lost in numbers too great to count. Battles fought over the same ground again and again with nothing gained. Families at home wept as more names appeared in the lists of the dead, their dreams of reunion turning to ashes. The war was no longer about pride or glory. It had become survival, and survival was slipping further from their grasp. And yet, the most chilling truth is this. The Confederacy's leaders knew the cost, but they chose pride over peace. They could have sought negotiation, could have spared their people further suffering, but to admit defeat was unthinkable. Their arrogance demanded sacrifice, demanded blood, demanded that young men continue to march into the jaws of death. The war dragged on, not because victory was within reach, but because pride would not let them stop. By 1864, the toll was unbearable. Cities lay in ruins, railroads torn apart, farms burned. Sherman's march to the sea carved a path of destruction across Georgia, breaking the South's will to resist. Yet Confederate generals still spoke of turning the tide. Even as Richmond itself faced collapse, they whispered of miracles, of last-minute victories, of destiny fulfilled. But destiny had abandoned them, and all that remained was suffering. The cost of arrogance is written in blood across the fields of America. It is written in the shattered lives of soldiers who never returned, in the grief of mothers who buried their sons, in the hunger of families left to starve. The Confederate generals never expected the war to last 4 years. But their pride ensured it would, dragging their people into a darkness from which there was no escape. So the question lingers, haunting and unresolved. Did they truly believe in the illusions they told? Or did they simply refuse to admit the truth? Were they blinded by pride, or were they willing to sacrifice everything, even their people, for the sake of honor? The answer is buried with the dead, hidden in the silence of the graves that stretch across the land. The war they thought would end in glory became a tragedy without end. And as the Confederacy bled, the North grew stronger, more determined, more relentless. The cost of arrogance was not just defeat, it was destruction. And the echoes of that arrogance still haunt the story of a nation divided, reminding us that pride, once unleashed, can consume everything.
What happens when a nation refuses to see that the dream it fights for has already slipped through its fingers? And what if the very hope that once kept an army marching turns into the cruelest illusion of all? By the time 1864 arrived, the Confederacy was no longer the confident young nation that had risen in defiance just 3 years before. The streets that once rang with cheers were now hushed with sorrow. Families that once waved their sons off to battle now counted the names of the dead, scrawled across newspapers that read like lists of doom. Yet the generals still spoke of destiny. They told their weary soldiers that victory was close, that the North would tire, that one final campaign would turn the tide. But in truth, desperation had replaced confidence, and the road ahead was a road into darkness. The war had consumed everything. The fertile fields of Virginia, once green with crops, were trampled into mud by endless armies. Railroads had splintered, their ties burned as fuel, their iron rails twisted into grotesque shapes. In towns across the South, hunger had become the constant companion of the people. Bread riots broke out in Richmond as women, desperate to feed their children, stormed bakeries and storehouses. Prices soared beyond imagination. A pound of flour, once a household staple, cost more than a month's wages. Confederate money, printed in desperation, was little more than worthless paper. Yet still, the leaders insisted the sacrifice would bring freedom. On the battlefield, desperation took shape in blood. Robert E. Lee, still revered as the South's greatest commander, led his men through campaign after campaign. Against Ulysses S. Grant in 1864, the battles became a war of attrition, fought not for glory, but for survival. At the Wilderness, the forest itself caught fire, trapping the wounded in a hell of smoke and flame. At Spotsylvania, men fought hand-to-hand in the mud, a brutal struggle that turned trenches into rivers of blood. At Cold Harbor, Confederate soldiers watched with grim horror as thousands of Union men fell in a single charge, cut down in minutes. But unlike earlier victories, the South could no longer replace its own losses. Each casualty was irreplaceable, each death another nail in the coffin of the Confederacy. The people at home suffered just as greatly. Plantations that once thrived on cotton and tobacco now lay abandoned, stripped bare by advancing armies or burned in retreat. Enslaved people fled to Union lines, seeking freedom and weakening the very system the Confederacy fought to preserve. For the first time, Southerners faced the reality that their way of life was vanishing, not just threatened by Northern armies, but crumbling from within. The illusion of control slipped further away with every passing month. Desperation also revealed itself in politics. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, clung to power but grew increasingly isolated. His speeches promised victory, but his people heard only empty words. They no longer wanted promises. They wanted peace. Yet peace could not be admitted. To confess defeat was to betray the cause, and so the war dragged on, fueled not by hope of victory, but by fear of surrender. The generals whispered of miracles, of European intervention, of some sudden collapse of Northern will, but these were fantasies, illusions spun to mask the truth. Meanwhile, the North pressed forward relentlessly. General William Tecumseh Sherman began his march into the heart of Georgia, a campaign that would break not just Confederate armies, but the very spirit of the South. His soldiers carved a path of destruction, burning crops, tearing up railroads, and leaving behind a trail of desolation. To the South, it was cruelty. To the North, it was strategy, a way to end the war by breaking the Confederacy's ability to fight. As Sherman's men marched to the sea, the illusion of Confederate hope burned in the ashes of Atlanta. Still, Confederate leaders clung to their dream. They told their people that one great victory remained, that if they endured a little longer, fortune would shift. Lee's army, starving and exhausted, was asked to hold the lines again and again. Soldiers marched barefoot, their uniforms in tatters, their rifles rusting for lack of oil. Yet they fought, not because they believed in victory, but because they feared dishonor, because they had been told too many times that their sacrifice was sacred, that the cost of this desperation was staggering. By late 1864, death had touched nearly every Southern family. Graveyards overflowed, fields became burial grounds, and entire communities seemed to vanish into silence. The war that was supposed to be short had become a devouring monster, and still it demanded more. The illusion of hope kept it alive, but hope had become a cruel lie. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: why did they not surrender sooner? Why drag a people through such misery when the outcome was all but certain? The answer lies in the iron grip of pride. The Confederate leaders could not admit defeat, not when they had promised so much. They could not return to their people and confess that the dream of independence had been nothing more than a mirage. And so they pushed forward, demanding more lives, more sacrifice, more suffering. Even as the walls closed in. By the dawn of 1865, the Confederacy was a shadow of its former self. Richmond trembled under the threat of Union armies. Railroads lay in ruins, and soldiers deserted in despair. Families starved as the government begged them to endure just a little longer. But endurance was gone. The illusion of hope had been stretched too thin, and reality could no longer be denied that the long road of desperation had led only to ruin. What began as confidence had turned to arrogance. What began as pride had become despair, and what began as hope had ended as illusion. The Confederacy had gambled everything on victory and found only destruction. Yet in their desperation, they had dragged their people with them, unwilling to surrender, even as the end became inevitable. The tragedy of the Confederacy lies not only in its defeat, but in the years of suffering that could have ended sooner. Had they faced reality, countless lives might have been spared. But they chose illusion over truth, pride over mercy, and in doing so, condemned themselves to a fate of devastation. So we are left with a haunting question. Was it courage that kept them fighting to the end? Or was it pride masquerading as courage? The line between the two is thin, blurred by the smoke of battle and the tears of the grieving. And in that blurred line, the Confederacy lost itself, trapped in the illusion of hope that became its final downfall. What happens when the dreams of generals collapse beneath the crushing weight of reality? And what if the war that was never meant to last 4 years ends in a silence more devastating than all the cannons that came before it? By the dawn of 1865, the Confederacy was gasping for breath. The proud nation that had once marched with confidence, certain of destiny, now staggered under the relentless advance of Union armies. The cities that had been symbols of defiance, Atlanta, Savannah, Columbia, were smoldering ruins. Railroads lay twisted like broken bones across the countryside. Fields were stripped bare, families starved, and soldiers deserted in despair. The illusion of hope, once clung to so fiercely, was now a tattered banner fluttering in the cold wind of defeat. In Richmond, the Confederate capital, the once bustling streets had grown eerily quiet. Bread riots were no longer shocking, they were expected. Children with hollow cheeks begged for food, while their mothers prayed for a mercy that never came. President Jefferson Davis still spoke of endurance, of victory just beyond the horizon, but his words fell into empty air. Even his staunchest supporters could feel the truth pressing in on them. The Confederacy was dying. Yet pride would not let them speak it aloud. Robert E. Lee, the most revered general of the South, carried the weight of this crumbling nation on his weary shoulders. His Army of Northern Virginia, once the pride of the Confederacy, was now a shadow of its former self. Starving men, their uniforms ragged and their rifles rusted, still followed him with loyalty, though they knew in their hearts that the end was near. Lee himself had no illusions left. He saw the faces of his men, gaunt with hunger, and he knew the war could not be won. But still, he fought. Not for victory, victory was gone, but for honor, for the belief that surrender without one last fight would betray the blood already spilled. Grant, his Union counterpart, pressed forward with grim determination. He understood that every day the war continued meant more suffering, more death. His mission was not glory, it was to end the war. And so, in battle after battle, he ground Lee's army down. At Petersburg, the two armies faced each other in trenches for months, locked in a stalemate that bled the Confederates dry. Soldiers lived like rats, burrowing into the earth, waiting for attacks that came like waves of thunder and smoke. Disease stalked the camps. Hunger gnawed at every man, but still Lee held on, desperate to delay the inevitable. When Richmond finally fell in April 1865, it was not with a grand battle, but with a quiet collapse. Confederate leaders fled the city in the dead of night, flames lighting their retreat as warehouses and bridges were set ablaze to keep them from Union hands. The people of Richmond woke to chaos, their capital burning, their government gone. The illusion of Confederate strength had crumbled into ash and smoke. Lee's army retreated west, chased by Grant's relentless forces. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia, reduced to a starving column of gaunt soldiers, stumbled through the mud. They were barefoot, their uniforms threadbare, their weapons falling apart. They fought when cornered, but the fights were desperate, hopeless struggles against overwhelming numbers. Lee knew it was over, but he wrestled with the weight of surrender. What would it mean for his men? For the cause? For his honor? At last, with his army surrounded near the small village of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee made his decision. The war could not go on. To fight further would mean nothing but slaughter. He chose to surrender not because he wanted to, but because he could no longer justify the suffering of his men. The pride that had once kept the war alive finally bowed to reality. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house. The moment was quiet, almost ordinary, but it carried the weight of 4 years of blood and fire. Grant, rumpled and mud-stained, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home with their horses, free to plant their fields and begin anew. They would not be treated as traitors, but as men who had fought and lost. Lee, dressed in full uniform, accepted with dignity, though his heart must have been breaking. In that moment, the illusion of Confederate destiny shattered completely. The war was over, but even as peace began, the echoes of those illusions lingered. For the soldiers who returned home, there was no triumph, no glory, only ruins. Farms were gone, cities burned, families broken. The South had gambled everything on pride and lost everything in return. Mothers who had once believed their sons would be home by Christmas now wept over graves that stretched across the land. Fathers who had promised victory returned in silence, defeated and hollow. The war had taken not just lives, but futures, dreams, and the very fabric of Southern society. And yet, even in defeat, some clung to the old illusions. They told themselves the cause had been noble, that their bravery had not been in vain. They built myths of honor and glory to mask the reality of devastation. But the truth could not be hidden forever. The Confederate generals had never expected the war to last 4 bloody years. They had promised a quick triumph, but instead delivered a nightmare of endless suffering. Their pride had demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice had devoured a generation. The bitter end of the Confederacy is not simply the story of defeat. It is the story of how illusions can lead nations astray, how pride can blind even the greatest leaders, and how the refusal to face reality can destroy everything. It is a story written in blood across the fields of Antietam, Gettysburg, and Petersburg. It is whispered in the silent ruins of Richmond and etched into the names carved on countless headstones. As we look back on this war, we are left with haunting questions. Could it have ended sooner? Could the suffering have been spared? Or was it doomed from the beginning, trapped by the arrogance of men who believed destiny was theirs to command? The answers are elusive, but the lessons are clear. Wars are not won by illusions. They are not decided by pride. They are measured in lives lost, in tears shed, in futures destroyed. The Confederate generals never expected the war to last 4 years. But it did. And in those 4 years, their illusions turned to ashes, their pride to sorrow, and their dreams to graves. The bitter end was not just the fall of a nation. It was the reckoning of arrogance, the collapse of illusions, and the unmasking of truths too painful to bear. Even today, the echoes of that bitter end remain. They remind us that history is not just a story of battles and leaders, but of people, of soldiers who marched believing they would be home by Christmas, of families who prayed in vain, of a nation that paid the ultimate price for pride. And as we remember, we are forced to confront the deepest question of all. How many times must humanity repeat the same mistakes before we learn that illusions, no matter how bright, always end in shadow